Hey everyone, and welcome to this brand new ReactJS series. In this series, my goal is going to be taking someone that has maybe only heard about React, maybe someone who is interested in learning about it but doesn't know too much about it, and turning them into someone who is extremely confident in their React abilities and confident enough to start getting, for example, entry-level jobs when it comes to front-end development on React. I have actually made a React series before, but that was a couple years ago, and it's actually outdated because ReactJS is such an ever-evolving library. There has been so many changes, and I'm excited to share all of them with you guys. I'm going to be starting from scratch, and each video will cover a brand new topic and go over the best practices for how you can code React, and especially how you should go about learning React and practicing these new skills that you'll be learning. As you can see from my last videos, I did a huge 31-part series on Material UI, and I plan on making this React course even more extensive and obviously completely free because it's all going to be on YouTube. And just a reminder, if you find value in these videos, if you like these series, it really helps if you drop a like. I read every single comment that you guys post, and I absolutely hope that you guys consider subscribing because there's going to be so many more videos coming out, from things like introductory React stuff all the way to the more extensive things like state management in React, hooking React up to a backend, how to deploy React to the web and use AWS, for example. So with that being said, let's jump straight into it. React is essentially a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. It is one of the most used front-end libraries right now in the job market, and there is a huge demand for this skill, so it's no wonder that you're here trying to learn it. Essentially, how it works is React is one of the new wave, I guess you could call, front-end frameworks where it works off of what is known as a single page application. And this is not just exclusive to React, but Angular and Vue also run off of this sort of single page application methodology, and I will show you exactly what that means. So for example, you can see here I have the Walmart website open, and if I were to, for example, go into a random let's say for example page, you'll see when I click it, the entire page reloads. Keep your eye on this header, for example. If I were to change my directory, you'll see that the entire header will reload if I keep on going to newer and newer pages. The whole web page sort of reloads and sort of readjusts itself. This is how regular websites used to work before this single page application methodology sort of came onto the scene. Now I have a random site over here that is built off of React, and you will see here it has a couple of different sections: news, guides, and interviews. And right now we are on news. If I were to click the guides section, you will see the only thing that really changes here is the actual content that is being rendered in this middle column. If you keep your eye on everything around it, you will see nothing else is actually being re-rendered until we get to a page where everything needs to be re-rendered. So for example, it looks like this page isn't loading right now, but on the actual website itself, this events page does not have all the content on the side. So for example, these VODs or events. If I were to go between these news, guides, and interviews where only the middle content changes, you'll see nothing else will actually change, even though the URL will change. And this is sort of what a single page application is. Every page can be broken down into a certain amount of what are known as components. For example, the most basic layout you will see on the website is you have a header at the top, you will have some content in the middle, and then maybe a footer at the bottom. Now, when you are not using a single page application framework, when you want to change something that is displayed on any one of these three, the whole web page will reload and all three of these components will reload, which takes up a lot of time and processing power on, a person's web browser. But with a single page application, if you click something that only has an effect, let's say for example, if you go to a new page and the only thing that is going to be different on that new page is the content within it, and the header or anything, the header and the footer are staying the same, then only the HTML within that content area right in the middle will be changing. And you can actually explain that the explanation can actually go a lot more deeper if you get into, for example, the rendering tree and the DOM, what is known as the DOM in React. But we're going to go into that in more detail in future videos. But for now, we're going to keep it simple, and just I want you guys to really walk away with the idea that in React, in single page applications, the web page is split into these subsections known as components. In this example, I've shown you some very basic splitting of components. So for example, a header, footer, and a content area. But even the things in the content area can be split down further. For example, in this content area, you can see, for example, if I go back to news, each one of these little cards that shows a brand new news item is its own component. And inside of this component, you can see here, for example, it has a, a time thing where it shows you how long ago an article was posted. It has a thumbnail for the article. It has, the author's name, and it has the title and maybe the category that that article falls into. And you can see this whole column over here, which is a component in its own, is built off of smaller components, which are these sort of article cards. And as you start learning React, you'll see that you'll start to notice on different applications and websites that every website is really broken down into a lot of these sort of sub components. So it's very good to sort of keep that in mind as we move on. Now, when it comes to actually creating a new React application and sort of testing all of this out on your own, the documentation gives you a lot of different options, and in my opinion, it could be a bit overwhelming. For example, if you just go to the Get Started page of the documentation, you can see there is a ton of different ways to sort of get started and start doing React. Now, a couple of them I want to briefly touch on, and one of them is called CodeSandbox.io. Now, Code Sandbox is an absolutely amazing website where you can sort of, what it will allow you to do is it gives you this web editor, this web code editor, where you don't have to actually install any libraries or any dependencies on your computer, and you can actually just straight up start coding a React application just from the web. You can start playing around with it just over here. So I use this a lot in my Material UI tutorials, and I think if you're just learning, it's extremely helpful. And also it enables you, for example, if you don't have a very good computer, let's say you're working on, for example, when I was doing Law React, one of the things I would do is I would code on my iPad, and you can't really install code editors and stuff on your iPad, but if you go to codesandbox.io, I was able to sort of make videos and tutorials on my iPad instead. So this gives you, this is just something I wanted to briefly touch on. If you're someone that maybe doesn't have the best computer, you don't have a lot of space for installing whole applications, then Code Sandbox might be the best thing for you. You'll see when I get into creating a React application on my Windows environment, the layout that we actually get and the file structure that we actually get from that is very similar to what you will have on Code Sandbox. So you'll be able to actually follow along. But the de facto standard way that is most likely what a lot of you guys are going to end up using is this tool called Create React App. Now, Create React App is pretty much an MPX tool, which is sort of a subsection of Node and NPM, which we'll get into in just a second. And it pretty much allows you to create a React application without worrying about any of the plumbing that goes underneath React. It's super convenient, and it's not like the more you know React, you're going to sort of walk away from this and start doing all the underlying plumbing yourself. You probably, for your React needs, and even, if you start working at a company that does React, you most likely will still be able to get away with creating a React app using this. So let's cover how to actually create our first React application. The first thing you're going to want to do is, depending on whether you're on Windows, Mac, or, Linux, you're going to make sure that you have Node.js installed. When you install Node.js, it is going to come with Node, and it is also going to come with npm. So once you've gone through this installation page, you could just Google, node install. The official website has installers that you can use for for any environment that you are on, and it's extremely straightforward. Then once you're on, you could type node-version, I believe, node-version. and you should be able to see your node version and npm -- version, and you should be able to see your npm version as well. Now, once you have gone ahead and installed node and npm, the next thing we want to make sure we have installed is npx. npx is similar to npm in the sense that it has two of the same common letters in it, but what it really is it is a tool for npm that allows you to bulk install things essentially and set up applications and execute really complex things without have to worrying about the actual execution of it yourself. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to type npm install -g npx into your terminal once you have this installed. And if you're not familiar with Node at all, essentially when you want to install new dependencies, so for example, let's say we're doing the React, we're doing our site in React, you are essentially going to want to install dependencies as you go on. Maybe you want to have a graph on your website, so or maybe you want to have a UI library, in which case you install, Material UI, which is a popular, UI tool similar to Bootstrap for React. The way you would do that is you would type npm install, or it's interchangeable, and then the name of the package. This -g is going to be pretty much, we're only going to use it for npx, and what that does is it will install it globally on your computer. So no matter where you are, whether or not you are in a node directory, it will install that so you can use it anywhere. And we need that for npx because we are going to be using npx to actually create our React applications. Once you have that installed, this is going to be how you create your first application. You type npx create -react app. So what we're doing is we're saying, okay, npx, I want you to run the create React app toolchain and then the name of your application. So I am going to go ahead, and by the way, if you're on Mac, any terminal would work for this stuff. If you are on Windows, you are going to have to install some sort of terminal that runs based on Unix. I personally use Git Bash. I find it to be my favorite one for Windows, and while in a professional environment I usually code on my Mac, I've still done a lot of coding on Windows, and most of these tutorials, just because this is where I do my videos, are going to be on Windows itself. I may do a video on my Mac sometime in the future, just to, if there's any specific thing I want to show on a Mac environment, but for the most part, they're both extremely similar once you get into the actual application. So you're going to type npx create React app, and then you're going to type in the name of your application. So I'm going to call this like intro, just because it is my intro to React, and it is going to fire off a huge creating build that might take around anywhere from a minute to like 5 minutes, depending on the speed of your computer. Now, while this is running, I want to show you the code editor that we are going to be using to use React. And that code editor is actually called Visual Studio Code, VSCode. And this is the de facto standard for everything React and for most applications JavaScript. And I highly recommend sticking to VSCode while you guys follow these tutorials. It is by far the best editor for React, and you can see I already even have our sort of directory open, and you can see it's sort of creating these files over here as I'm talking, as it's creating it. And while it's creating it, let's go over some of the sort of directories and files that it's creating. So the first one we're going to look at is node modules. This is just going to be a giant folder with every single node or npm dependency that your application depends on. So the nice thing about Create React App is it is going to already add all the dependencies we need for our React application. And as you can see, there is a lot. And if I even sort of go up, you might recognize some of these. So you can see here, React is one of the dependencies that is already being installed. And that's pretty much what is in node modules. And it looks like this was completed. So before we go into starting our application, whoops, I minimized everything by shaking my shaking the terminal, a Windows feature, I guess. Let's slowly go through this file structure. So you can see here, this is my project file, and within it we have node modules, which I just covered, this public folder, this source folder with a bunch of files in it, getting a .getignore, a package.json, a package.lock.json, and a readme. The readme, let's cancel that for now. So the readme, let's start and look at all of the sort of important files that you are going to end up using as you sort of code React. So the first thing is every repository, and you'll see if I do an ls-la, if I cd into the intro and do an ls-la, you'll see here that there's a hidden folder also for Git that they have created that they that you can't see here because it's a hidden folder. But just know that they also create a .git repository for you. If you want to create your own Git repository, you can always do it rm-r.git to sort of nuke that folder, or you you can manually delete it from the Explorer itself. And that will allow you to, do another git init and set up your own Git repository. But the first thing we see here is the readme.md, which is, you'll find one of these in any well-known and decently popular used GitHub repositories. So in this file, they're just going to give you some ideas, on how you're supposed to use the create React app. So for example, they're like, if you want to run tests, you run npm test. If you run the actual application itself, you run npm start, and all of that stuff. So once you sort of start your application, and you sort of have an idea of what React does, you can always go ahead and delete that, create your own, do whatever you want with it type of thing. Now, a very important file is this package.json here. So let me go over what every single thing in this package.json is, because it is going to be very important over the life cycle of you using React. The first thing you are going to notice here is that we have, the name of our application, the version of our application, whether it's private or not, but I'm going to focus on the more basic stuff. So for example, the real big thing you need to know about is these dependencies. So whenever you want to use a new sort of, library in your application, you are going to use npm, which is sort of the thing that keeps track of all our dependencies for our application. And you're going to type npm I and then the package name. When you type that in, it will add the package to your dependency list with the version that you are currently using. And that is going to be extremely useful, because if you push this to GitHub and somebody pulls down, your code, you'll see in .gitignore, node modules is actually being ignored. And that is because node modules is a huge folder. It's like, in bigger applications, it can get higher than, 500 megabytes, for example. And you don't want to be storing something that big in a GitHub repo. So when somebody pulls your code down, they're going to want to run your application. And unless you have all these dependencies installed, the application is not going to run, because it's going to be missing a bunch of dependencies that it relies on. Now the question is, okay, how can someone that has just pulled my code down install all the exact same dependencies that I have? That way when they run the code, it is going to be the same experience. And package.json is the answer to that. Every time you install a new package, it will keep track of that package and its version here. And that way, when a new user pulls down your code, the first thing they do before they run it is they type npm I, and that will look at this list and it will install all the dependencies. And I know what you're thinking. We looked at this node modules thing, and there's at least 300 different dependencies in here. But if you look at this list, there's only 6. And that is because when you install something, it will also install all the packages that package is dependent on. So for example, React could be dependent on a bajillion of these dependencies in here. And that's why your nodes module folder will always have a lot more packages than you see here. And you can see here now, the next important thing to look at is this sort of scripts thing. So this scripts thing tells you all the sort of scripts you can run from npm. So if you were to run npm start, it will run this react-script start. And this react-scripts thing is something that comes built in from Create React App. Super helpful. I don't recommend you sort of edit this until we get to the more complex things, like how to deploy your application, and you won't really be editing a lot of this stuff for a lot of time. But it's just good to know all the stuff you can run. So for example, npm run start, npm build, npm test, npm eject. Build will create a production file, so a bundle of your application. We'll get into that in later videos. Test will run unit tests if you have any, which we will also cover in the next videos. Then we have our ESLint config. We're not going to go too far into that right now, and all of this stuff you can pretty much ignore. So that is what package.json is. Package.lock.json is pretty much just a list of all your dependencies with all the sort of sub dependencies and the exact versions. So if you ever wanted to bump the version of a dependency that you have, you would first delete your package lock. One tried and true way to make sure it works is you would delete your package lock. So if you go back to the package.json, you'll see some of the versions, we have a sort of little caret in top of it, and that will mean our application will run on any version greater than 16.3.1. So if you were to delete the package lock, which will get generated every time you npm I, that will show you exactly sort of the version that the last person who ran npm I had that dependency at. But if you were to delete this and reinstall it, it will get the greatest version. Let's say, for example, if 16.14.1 was available, it would upgrade to that. But if you had a package lock which locked this in at 16.13.1, when you reinstall it, it will stay to 16.13.1. And it might sound a bit confusing now, but don't worry, as you get into it, it'll make a lot more sense. Now let's get into the actual nitty-gritty details. So let's type npm start here. And as you will see, npm start, it hits this start script, which will run that react-scripts-start. And this might take a little, maybe like 30 seconds to actually run, but you'll see here you get a nice little thing. It's like, hey, you can see it running locally on here, or if you want to share it with anyone else in your network, it'll be running here. And if we go back, we can see we have our first React application running. And it's pretty much just a spinning logo. It'll be, some text over here and a link to the React documentation when you click it. Now, everything that you see here lives inside of this source, and I'm going to cover the most important files here. So we have our app.js. Actually, let's start with the index.js. This index.js is going to be the thing that sort of keeps that is going to be there in every single application, and it is what sort of calls the rest of the application. Now, the important thing to understand about React is it sort of works in this inside of your React.js files, it works on this language called JSX. And JSX is pretty much just a fancy way of saying it is plain HTML, but we also have embedded JavaScript inside of it. And the structure of your code when it comes to JSX will be the same. And there are two methodologies for how your each component gets structured. One is called the class-based methodology, and one is called the functional component methodology. And class-based used to be the standard, and we're not going to cover that because my previous videos covered class-based videos. But the standard right now is functional components. And what that means is, you will see here, if I open this up, this app.js represents a single component, and that component is a function instead of a class. And if I give you an example, so for example, if I type in class-based React component, you will see that there is a very, very, very different way of doing it. So for example, instead of having function app, we have, class, welcome, extends, react.component, and then a couple of rendered. Now, I'm going to, in the next video, more in depth go over how all of this structure works, but let's sort of just play around what we have here, just so you can start wrapping your head around sort of how all of this works. So I'm going to split my screen here, and we're going to pop this over here, and this is the one component we are going to look at right now. This is pretty much where everything is being rendered. You can see here, if you're familiar with HTML, we pretty much have a image tag, and the image tag is sort of what renders this image. Then we have some paragraph tags, and it says edit, and then some code tags to sort of make this look a bit fancier, and save to reload. So for example, if I were to change this to be this whole paragraph to be like hello YouTube, as soon as I save that file, what you're going to notice is bam, it is going to reload that with the dynamic change. And this is called, this is one of the most, dynamic changing is one of the most sought after features. It's really easy to develop on this because you can have your code on the left side of your screen, you can have React on the right side of your screen, and every change you make, it'll just automatically render everything. And it's really, really useful. I can change this to be like, learn how to use React. And you'll see here that text changes, and it's just a super, super cool workflow. Now, just to give you a sort of sneak peek of how JSX works, let's say I wanted this hello world to be in a JavaScript variable. I could type const, and let's call this, header text to be equal to something like hello YouTube. Now, what I can do is, inside of this return is going to be where all the sort of JSX lives. Everything outside of this is, for the most part, going to be just constant, just regular JavaScript. I can, whenever I want to display a variable or something from above the render, I can go to where I want to display it in the JSX, and I can use these curly braces. And these curly braces, when I add these in, will denote that I am going to add JavaScript code inside of it. So if I were to, for example, type, I could, even type console.logs or anything that is related to JavaScript. Now, I want to just display this header text. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put these squiggly braces. I'm going to put my variable inside of here, and you'll see if I reload it, it still shows the same. But if I, for example, edit it like hello YouTube from my variable, you'll see that it updates and it takes the text from here. So a lot of the time you're going to be, declaring like, we haven't talked about it yet, but state variables. We're going to be declaring things like functions and helper functions. And all of that is going to be outside of the JSX, outside of this return. And then when we want to use it in these returns, what we're going to do is we're going to simply wrap it around in these squiggly braces, which will allow us to call like a helper function, for example, or anything that we want. And we are going to touch upon concepts like that in the next video. But let's go back to the file structure, and you can see we have our app.js, we have our app.css. This is just, a basic CSS file that is what is applying all the stylings to here. If I were to delete everything in here and save it, you'll see that we have an unstyled application. So let's go ahead and put that back in. We have our index.js. Our index is going to be the root. I'm not going to go too in depth about this quite yet, but essentially your index is what calls your top level component. This is what sort of, this index file is, you sort of don't really want to change it until you get into more complex things like Redux and stuff like that. But essentially it is going to be called our root component. And in our situation, our root component is our app.js. And just to end this tutorial out, I'm going to create another component and nest it in here. So first of all, let's go to our source. We're going to create a new file, and we're going to call this like, so for example, let's call this like our test component.jsx. Or actually, we're going to make this like maybe, for example, a button. So a button with some text around it, and that button will be used to like take us to the React documentation. So let's call this like, documentation.jsx. You can name your file extensions JS or JSX. I personally prefer JSX because I like the little React icon it gives me here, and it differentiates it from your actual JS files. But honestly, there is almost no difference when it comes to it. So the first thing we're going to do when we make a new React component is we're going to import React from React. And then the next thing we're going to do is pretty much just basically we are going to create a function. So let's do it in the same ES5 way, in the same basic way that they do it, just to keep it very simple. We're going to copy and paste this, and we're going to sort of gut all the placeholder stuff, all the common stuff that they had there. And we're going to make this as simple as possible. So I'm going to have some h1 tags and say this is our new component. And I'm going to call this documentation, this function documentation, and I'm going to export it defaultly. And I'm going to show you in the next video sort of the structure that I like to structure my components. But for now, let's just keep the same structure they had before. So you can see I've made this new file and this new component, which is pretty much just some header text called "this is my new component," but it's not displaying anywhere. So the cool part about React is we can now nest our component into this component, and we can put it wherever we want. So the first thing I'm going to do is type import. I'm going to type in the name of the component, documentation, from, and I'm going to from / documentation. So I'm going to find the path, and let's move this over. And now what I can do is I can call this component as if it were a HTML element. So wherever I want it, let's say I want that to let's say I want to delete this. Let's delete that. So all we have is the hello from my YouTube variable. I can come in here, I can make some opening tags and type documentation. And then I can do these self-closing tags. These self-closing tags are equivalent to having an opening tag and then a closing tag. But as you can see, we're not going to put anything in the middle here. So what I can do is, instead of having an opening and closing tag, I can put a slash at the end of the opening tag, just like this. And this is what is known as a self-closing tag. It is used for anything, that you don't need anything in between the opening and closing tag. And you will see here, if I were to save this file now, bam, our new component is now nested inside of our app component, and it shows down here. If I wanted, I could put that component above this header text. So you're seeing I'm moving it around, and it's really like I'm taking a Lego block and inserting it wherever I want in sort of a bigger Lego structure. So now let's say I wanted to create a button. I'd be like, this is a button, and I can make it in this component. And because this component is nested within our app component, you can see that it will show up exactly where I want to put it. I can even put it, above the image, and you'll see here the whole component will be above it.